Hey, welcome to the briefing. What I'm going to cover with you today is this. When leadership ignores the warning and blames the team. This is DA Mailbag 0006, and I want to start with the part people usually clean up after the fact. A software team is building a capability. During development, the technical lead identifies vulnerabilities and raises them. The weaknesses are not hidden. They are not discovered 6 months after release. They are visible while there is still time to make a decision about design, scope, funding, schedule, testing, mitigation, and release. Leadership brushes them off. Not important right now, keep moving. We need the feature working first. Security can come later. The customer has not asked for that. Do not slow the schedule. Do not expand the scope. We will deal with it after the demonstration. Then 2 months later, the company spends real money on a surprise red team assessment. The red team gets into the capability, moves through the weak points, and confirms the same classes of exposure the team already raised. Now the tone changes. Why was this not caught? Why did the team build it this way? Why did nobody tell leadership? Why was the product not developed to industry standard? That is the moment I want to hold still. The warning was inconvenient when correcting it required time, money, and a leadership decision. The warning became urgent when an outside team proved it in a way leadership could no longer ignore. Then the people who raised it became the people standing closest to the blame. That is not just a technical problem. That is a standards problem, a risk problem, a leadership problem, and a trust problem. It is also how an organization creates a rush to failure, then rewrites the record so the failure appears to belong to the lowest level with technical access. I'm not going to tell you the development team is automatically right. Technical people can communicate poorly. They can overstate risk. They can treat every vulnerability as catastrophic. They can bury the actual consequence under jargon. They can fail to document, fail to escalate, or continue building outside approved direction. A red team can also find weaknesses nobody identified before. If that happened, the team has accountability. But that is not the scenario in front of us. In this scenario, vulnerabilities were identified, leadership was informed, the work was deprioritized, the capability kept moving, the external assessment later exposed the same weaknesses, and the team became the target. So the question is not simply who wrote the code. The real questions are sharper. What standard governed the work? Was that standard defined before development? Was the team given the time, funding, authority, and acceptance criteria required to meet it? What did leadership know? What did leadership do? Who did leadership tell? And who owned the risk after the warning left the technical team's hands? That is where this briefing is going. And let's go back to the development floor before the red team ever shows up. The capability is moving. Features are being built. Integrations are coming together. Demonstrations are scheduled. Product leadership wants visible progress. Program leadership wants schedule confidence. Executives want something they can show. The customer may be asking for more capability, more speed, and a clearer delivery date. The team is doing what development teams do. They are solving one problem, finding another, balancing technical debt, working through interfaces, permissions, authentication, logging, dependencies, data handling, and system behavior. And then the technical lead sees exposure. Maybe access control is too broad. Maybe one service has more privilege than it should. Maybe credentials are being handled in a way that works in development but creates unacceptable risk in deployment. Maybe input validation is weak. Maybe logging is not sufficient to reconstruct unauthorized activity. Maybe a dependency has a known vulnerability. Maybe the system trusts a component that should be treated as untrusted. Maybe the architecture is functional, but the security controls required for the intended environment are incomplete. The technical lead raises the vulnerability. Under normal circumstances, this is where I would slow down and explain what the technical team owes the organization. A warning has to be usable, saying, "This is insecure" is not enough by itself. The team has to identify the weakness, explain the likely consequence, connect it to the governing requirement, propose a corrective action, identify the effect on cost and schedule, and elevate the risk to someone with authority to make the decision. Technical professionals have a responsibility to translate. They cannot bury a leadership decision inside code, acronyms, severity ratings, or a 40-page technical report nobody outside the engineering team can use. They have to explain the issue in operating language. This weakness could permit unauthorized access. This control gap limits our ability to detect misuse. This design may work in an isolated prototype, but it is not ready for the intended operating environment. If we wait until after integration, the correction will require more time, more rework, and more testing. That is the technical standard. Identify it, explain it, document it, recommend a response, escalate it, keep the record accurate. And in this case, the technical team did that. Let's say that out loud so nobody can blur the record later. The team identified the vulnerabilities during development. The team explained the consequences. The team told leadership that the current design did not meet the security condition expected for the capability's intended use. The team raised what would be required to correct it. The team made leadership aware that delaying the work would carry risk. The issue was elevated to the people controlling priority, funding, schedule, scope, and release. The technical team did what it was supposed to do. That point is settled. We are not dealing with engineers who hid the risk. We are not dealing with a team that ignored an approved security requirement. We are not dealing with developers who were given the time, money, authority, and direction to make the correction and simply failed to execute. We are not dealing with a vulnerability that nobody saw until the red team arrived. The warning was raised. Leadership received it. Leadership brushed it off. That is where the failure changes levels. From the technical side, recognized secure development practice is clear about the direction of travel. Security is supposed to be integrated into the software development lifecycle. Roles have to be defined. Vulnerabilities have to be tracked. Security requirements have to be understood. Exceptions have to be reviewed. The organization has to address the risk created when a capability does not meet an established requirement. From the executive and COO side, the direction is just as clear. Risk management is not something leadership hands to the technical team and walks away from. Risk belongs inside governance, planning, resource, allocation, operating policy, decision authority, and organizational culture. Leadership establishes who owns the risk, who can accept it, what resources support the response, what limits apply, and how the organization will monitor the exposure. That is the dividing line. The technical team owns the technical warning and the quality of the technical work. Leadership owns the organizational decision made after receiving that warning. The team cannot allocate money it does not control. It cannot move a contractual milestone it does not own. It cannot reduce scope without authorization. It cannot decide what customer commitment will be changed. It cannot formally accept enterprise risk on behalf of an executive who refuses to put their name on it. That is not how authority works. If the executive controls the priority, the executive owns the trade-off. If the COO controls resources and operating sequence, the COO owns whether the corrective work receives time, people, money, and a place in the plan. If the program manager protects the schedule after receiving the warning, that schedule decision becomes part of the risk record. If the release authority sends the capability forward with known deficiencies, the release decision belongs to that authority. You do not get to exercise control on the front end and claim helplessness on the back end. You do not get to tell the team to keep moving, then disappear when movement produces the consequence they warned you about. That is where leadership takes a dive. Not because leaders accepted risk. Every serious organization accepts risk. Not because every vulnerability was not fixed immediately. No software team can remove every weakness, close every technical dead item, and satisfy every desirable control before each internal milestone. That is not realistic. Leadership failed because it accepted the benefit of moving forward without performing the responsibilities that come with accepting the exposure. There was no visible risk owner, documented acceptance, approved exception, temporary mitigation, restriction on use, scheduled return point, or clear condition that would force the organization to reopen the decision. There was no honest statement that leadership was choosing schedule over security for a defined period. There was only one direction: keep moving. Then leadership acted as though the issue had vanished. It had not vanished. It was still in the software. It was still in the architecture. It was still in the test condition. It was still in the operating plan. It was still in the backlog. It was still in the minds of the technical staff who knew exactly where the exposure remained. Leadership did not remove the risk. Leadership removed the discussion. Those are not the same thing, and this is where the first second-order effect begins. When a credible warning is dismissed, the technical team does not simply go back to work as though nothing happened. The team has to adjust around the decision. Someone records the vulnerability in a backlog, preserves the test evidence, adds a note to the architecture documentation, or changes a configuration to reduce a small part of the exposure. Someone warns the tester that a certain function is not ready. Someone tells the integration team not to rely too heavily on one control. Someone starts thinking about how difficult the eventual correction will become. That is behind-the-scenes work. It is work junior people and mid-level technical staff often perform without recognition because they are trying to protect the organization from an executive decision they were not allowed to change. They begin building unofficial guardrails around an officially ignored problem. They keep screenshots, preserve emails, add comments to tickets, and create technical notes explaining why the current condition exists. They try to keep the capability isolated longer than leadership originally planned. They answer questions carefully because they do not want someone to mistake a functional demonstration for a secure release. None of that appears on the executive dashboard. The dashboard says development is moving. The meeting slide says the milestone is green. The feature demonstration works. Leadership receives the appearance of progress while technical staff are quietly spending energy containing the exposure leadership refused to own. That hidden labor is the first bill, and then comes the second bill. The team continues building on top of the unresolved weakness. More code depends on it. More interfaces touch it. More documentation assumes it. More test cases are written around the current design. More people become involved. More customer expectations form. The correction becomes harder. A vulnerability identified during design may require a design adjustment. The same vulnerability corrected after integration may require code changes, interface changes, new test cases, updated documentation, retesting, regression analysis, configuration updates, and another release review. The organization calls that technical debt. Sometimes it is. In this case, part of it is executive debt. The technical team did not forget the work. Leadership moved the work into the future because the present cost was inconvenient. The future cost becomes larger. And junior staff are the ones who have to pay it in hours. They work late, they cancel planned development. They stop work on the next release. They rebuild documentation. They answer emergency questions. They explain old decisions to new people. They recreate evidence from meetings executives barely remember. They prepare the technical material leadership suddenly needs for a customer briefing. They write the remediation plan, update the risk register that should have contained the issue 2 months earlier, prepare the retest, and sit through meetings where people who dismissed the warning now ask why the repair is taking so long. That is what terrible executive decisions look like from below. They look like overtime, rework, interrupted priorities, and junior people cleaning up the consequence while senior people debate the wording of the status update. The executive decision may have taken 30 seconds. The cleanup can take months, and then leadership funds a surprise red team. Let's be clear about what the red team does and does not prove. A red team applies adversarial pressure. It tests assumptions. It looks for weak trust boundaries. It chains vulnerabilities together. It shows what an attacker can reach, what the organization detects, what it misses, and how separate weaknesses combine into a usable path. That is valuable work. The red team did not create the vulnerability. It did not create the earlier warning. It did not create the leadership decision to deprioritize the correction. It created independent evidence that leadership's unresolved exposure was real. The test did not begin the story, it confirmed the story. That distinction is critical because weak leaders love to treat external confirmation as the first moment knowledge existed. It is easier to say the red team found this than to say our team warned us about this and we chose not to act. One statement makes leadership sound surprised. The other makes leadership accountable. That is why the timeline matters. What was known before the test, what was documented, who received it, what decision was made, what resources were denied, what conditions changed, what did the red team later confirm. If the external finding matches the internal warning, the company cannot honestly frame the result as a failure of technical discovery. The team discovered it. Leadership did not control it. That is the failure. Now the third order effects begin. The red team finding creates a rush of activity. Emergency meetings, executive summaries, customer questions, technical deep dives, remediation estimates, schedule changes, new priorities, retesting requirements, contract discussions, security reviews, and leadership briefings. Who prepares all of that? Usually the same technical staff whose warning was dismissed. The junior engineer who raised the concern now has to reproduce the vulnerability for executives. The developer who was told not to spend time on the correction now has to estimate how quickly it can be fixed. The tester who was not given authority to stop the release now has to explain why the weakness survived. The security lead who was told the issue was not important enough now has to build the remediation sequence. The project staff have to reconstruct the decision history. They search emails, recover meeting notes, compare ticket dates, find the original screenshots, rebuild the technical timeline, and prepare evidence that the organization already possessed. Then they have to do it carefully because they are not only solving the technical problem, they are navigating the political problem created by leaders who may not want the record to be clear. That is a different kind of labor. It is not engineering, it is institutional self-defense. People begin choosing words based on who might feel exposed. The report says the risk was not fully prioritized. Instead of saying leadership declined the correction, the timeline says the issue remained open instead of saying the decision maker took no action. The briefing says there was a communication gap even though the warning was delivered and leadership simply did not like the cost. Junior staff learned very quickly how executive failure gets translated into passive language. Nobody decided. The risk remained. Resources were constrained. The issue was not elevated. The condition developed. No, someone decided. Someone controlled the resources. Someone received the warning. Someone chose not to elevate it. Someone allowed the condition to continue. Passive language is often where accountability goes to hide. Then comes the blame meeting. Why did the team build it this way? Why did nobody tell us? Why was this not developed to industry standard? That phrase, industry standard, gets pulled out after the failure, as though it had been sitting clearly inside the development plan from the beginning. So let's apply an actual operating standard. From the technical side, secure development practice requires the organization to integrate security into development, define responsibilities, manage vulnerabilities, assess the product, and address weaknesses before they become released exposure. That responsibility does not live only with the developer. It includes project leadership, product ownership, testing, security, operations, and senior management. From the executive side, enterprise risk practice requires risk to be integrated into governance, strategy, planning, reporting, resource allocation, policy, and culture. Roles, responsibilities, and authorities must be established. Resources have to match the strategy. Oversight has to exist. Someone with actual authority has to own the residual exposure. CISA makes the leadership expectation even plainer. Cybersecurity is not supposed to remain buried in the information technology department. It belongs at the board, chief executive, and senior executive level. Secure by design is not a request for developers to personally absorb every consequence. It is a call for manufacturers and their leaders to treat security as a business responsibility. That is the industry direction from both sides. The technical team identifies, evaluates, communicates, and works the vulnerability. Leadership establishes the governing standard, provides resources, makes the trade-off, controls release, and owns accepted risk. In this case, the technical team fulfilled its side. It raised the risk, translated the risk, identified the consequence, documented the issue, recommended correction, and elevated the decision. Leadership failed its side. It did not establish a controlled exception, assign risk ownership, resource the correction, limit the capability, create a return point, reopen the decision before the red team, or preserve an honest accountability record. Then after the result, leadership attempted to hold the team to the very standard leadership refused to enforce during development. That is not a misunderstanding. That is unacceptable leadership. I'm not going to soften it. It is unacceptable to use authority to override a technical warning, then use the outcome to attack the people who gave you the warning. It is unacceptable to demand speed, deny the resources required for control, and later pretend the team independently chose the risk. It is unacceptable to protect the executive narrative by sacrificing the credibility of junior staff. It is unacceptable to call people accountable for decisions they did not have authority to make, and it is unacceptable to stand in front of a team after the red team confirms their concern and say leadership did not know. Leadership knew. The issue was raised. The issue was brushed off. The issue was left open. The external test confirmed it. That is the record. This is also where the corporate gaslighting becomes sharper. The team is not merely hearing a different interpretation of a complicated event. They are being asked to accept a version that removes leadership's decision and inserts technical negligence in its place. You told us, but not clearly enough. You documented it, but not in the right place. You recommended a correction, but you did not make us understand. You followed the chain, but you should have escalated further. You followed direction, but you should have stopped the release. Notice what is happening. Every standard moves after the event. There is always one more thing the subordinate supposedly should have done, one more email, one more presentation, one more escalation, one more refusal, one more act of courage required from the person with less authority, while the person with more authority claims they had no responsibility to act on what was already in front of them. That is how leadership transfers the burden downward. The employee is expected to overcome the authority structure, resource decision, schedule pressure, and executive denial, then personally prevent the outcome. That is not accountability. That is leadership trying to turn subordinates into human insurance policies against executive judgment. When the subordinate cannot carry that impossible burden, leadership says the team failed. That is why people become furious. They know the organization did not merely make a bad decision. It is now asking them to participate in a false explanation of the bad decision. That cuts deeper than the technical failure. The vulnerability can be corrected, the test can be rerun, the release can be delayed. But when leadership tells employees their documented reality did not happen, it damages their relationship with the organization itself. They stop asking, how do we fix the product? They start asking, how do I protect myself from these people? That is the moment the culture changes. The next effect is defensive work. People begin copying more leaders on emails, requesting written confirmation for routine decisions, repeating verbal direction back in writing, preserving screenshots, keeping personal timelines, and refusing to trust meetings that do not produce minutes. They become careful about what they say in informal conversations. They use words that protect them instead of words that help the team understand the issue quickly. That behavior slows the organization. Leadership may complain that the team has become bureaucratic. Leadership created the bureaucracy. People are documenting defensively because experience taught them that the decision record will be rewritten if the outcome is bad. People do not build these defenses because they enjoy paperwork. They build them because leadership demonstrated that memory follows power. The organization loses speed not because technical people are resistant, but because every decision now requires proof that the decision occurred. The next effect is silence. The next engineer sees a concern and calculates the personal risk of raising it. Will leadership listen? Will the issue be dismissed? Will my name become attached to the problem? Will I be accused of slowing the program? Will I be blamed later if the warning is not acted on? The engineer may still speak, but perhaps not as early, not as openly, and only after gathering enough evidence to survive an attack. That delay matters. Weak signals are most valuable before they become obvious. If employees wait until the vulnerability is undeniable, the organization has already lost time, options, and control. Some employees stop raising concerns altogether. They perform the assigned task. They follow the written direction. They stop offering judgment. They stop saying, here's what I think is coming. They wait for leadership to ask, and that is organizational silence. Leaders who created it may misread the silence as alignment. Nobody is objecting. The team must agree. No, the team may have learned that objection does not change the decision and may create personal exposure. Silence is not agreement when leadership has punished voice. It is adaptation. The employee is surviving the culture leadership built. Then comes the loss of discretionary effort. Strong technical teams do more than complete assigned work. They notice patterns, connect risks across functions, protect future maintainers, think beyond the ticket, warn leadership about second-order effects, and take ownership before being told. That extra judgment is where much of the organization's resilience lives. When leadership blames people for raising and carrying risk responsibly, that discretionary effort begins to disappear. People stop staying late to solve a problem leadership created. They stop volunteering for high-visibility work. They stop taking on ambiguous responsibility. They stop offering the creative alternative that could protect both schedule and security. They give the organization exactly what it formally requested and nothing more. Then leadership says the team lacks initiative. Again, leadership created the condition. You cannot punish initiative when it creates friction, then demand initiative when you need rescue. You cannot ignore expert judgment, then complain that the experts have become passive. You cannot use people as cleanup crews for executive decisions and expect them to remain emotionally invested in the next executive priority. Eventually, the best people leave. They do not always leave immediately. They update the resume, take the recruiter's call, stop planning their future inside the company, and disengage before they resign. When they go, the organization loses more than technical knowledge. It loses the people who understood the hidden dependencies, remembered the old decisions, recognized the recurring pattern, and knew where the next failure was likely to form. Then leadership hires replacements and wonders why the new team needs months to understand the system. That is another bill. The original decision protected 2 months of schedule. The organization may spend a year rebuilding lost capability and trust. Now let's apply the 3 accountability questions. What did you know? What did you do? Who did you tell? Start with the technical team. What did the team know? It knew the capability contained specific vulnerabilities. It knew those weaknesses created exposure in the intended environment. It knew correction would require time, resources, or a change in scope. It knew delaying the work would increase later rework and testing. What did the team do? It identified the vulnerabilities, reproduced or validated them, explained the consequences, connected them to the expected security requirement, documented the issue, recommended corrective action, identified the likely effect on schedule, and elevated the matter. Who did the team tell? It told leadership. The people controlling priority resources, development sequence, and release received the warning. The technical team can answer all 3 questions. That is not a minor point. It means the warning completed its movement through the technical portion of the chain. Now ask leadership. What did leadership know? Leadership knew vulnerabilities had been identified. Leadership knew the team considered them material. Leadership knew correction required time or money. Leadership knew the capability would later face testing. Leadership knew the current plan left the concerns unresolved. What did leadership do? Did it approve the correction? No. Did it reduce scope? No. Did it isolate the capability? No. Did it document a controlled exception? No. Did it assign a risk owner? No. Did it establish mitigation? No. Did it create a return date? No. Leadership told the team to keep moving. Who did leadership tell? Did the decision move to the executive authorized to accept the risk? Did the customer receive notice? Did the security authority receive the unresolved condition? Did the COO align the operating plan and resources with the decision? Did the release authority understand what remained open? If those answers are weak or non-existent, that is the accountability failure. Leadership cannot answer the questions by saying, the technical team owns security. No, the technical team owned the technical work. Leadership owned the decision not to resource, schedule, restrict, or escalate the correction. Authority matters. If you have authority to override the recommendation, you inherit responsibility for the consequence of that override. That is leadership. Now apply pro. Because the organization clearly failed to read the complete risk. At the personal level, leadership's decision places individual employees at risk. Reputation, evaluation, promotion, employment, professional confidence, trust, health, family time. The junior engineer may spend nights and weekends correcting a problem leadership chose not to address during normal development. The team may absorb the stress of emergency remediation while executives continue operating on the original calendar. There's also ethical risk. Employees may be pressured to describe the earlier warning in softer language. They may be asked to support a presentation that implies leadership was unaware. They may have to decide whether to protect their career or protect the accuracy of the record. That is not a position responsible leaders should create for subordinates. At the role level, the consequences spread into execution. Plan development stops. Engineers are reassigned. Integration has to be repeated. Testing expands. Documentation changes. Customer commitments move. Releases slip. The team's credibility suffers even though the team identified the issue. Supervisors spend time rebuilding the timeline instead of managing the work. Security and development begin arguing over ownership. The original vulnerability becomes a program-level disruption. At the organizational level, the effects are larger. Financial loss, contract exposure, customer distrust, reputation damage, audit concerns, release uncertainty, talent loss, reduced innovation, slower decisions, defensive communication, a culture where people learn to hide risk or wait until someone outside the company confirms it. Now look one turn further. What happens to future testing? The red team becomes associated with punishment. Developers begin preparing to survive the assessment instead of using it to learn. Managers hide incomplete work. Teams optimize for passing the visible test rather than controlling the actual exposure. Findings become political. Security becomes an opposing force. The organization may technically increase testing while operationally reducing honesty. That is a third-order effect. A control designed to reveal truth becomes another mechanism people learn to manage for appearance. The company spends more money and receives less truth. That is what happens when leadership turns evidence into ammunition. ACE now challenges the leadership story. The official conclusion may be that the development team failed to produce secure software. What evidence supports that? Did the team ignore a clearly established control? No. Did the team conceal the vulnerability? No. Did the team receive funding and time for correction, then fail to execute? No. Did the team represent the open issue as closed? No. Did the red team discover a completely unrelated exposure the team should reasonably have caught? That would be a separate question, but it is not the controlling fact in this case. Now test the opposite conclusion. Did the team identify the vulnerabilities? Yes. Did it explain the consequence? Yes. Did it document the concern? Yes. Did it recommend action? Yes. Did it elevate the risk? Yes. Did leadership deprioritize the correction? Yes. Did leadership fail to establish controlled acceptance? Yes. Did the red team later confirm the unresolved exposure? Yes, then stop pretending this is an unclear accountability problem. The technical team did its job, leadership did not. That's as simple as a statement I can make here. The fact that any of this has to be covered and spoke on is ridiculous and unacceptable. And it makes me sick to hear leadership like this is allowed to exist unchecked. ACE is not here to make every decision sound balanced when the evidence is not balanced. Open-minded analysis does not require us to weaken a clear conclusion. It requires us to test the conclusion honestly. We did. The failure point is leadership. Brain then asks what leadership was actually missing. Was information missing? No. The warning existed. Was a corrective option missing? No. The team raised the need. Was decision authority missing? Perhaps at one level. But the organization had an executive structure capable of funding a red team 2 months later. The issue could have been elevated. Was money completely unavailable? The organization later found money for independent testing and emergency cleanup. Was time unavailable? The organization spent far more time after the finding. Was there truly no alternative? Leadership could have reduced scope, limited use, isolated the capability, moved the test earlier, accepted the risk formally, or scheduled the correction before release. The missing ingredient was not information, it was willingness. Leadership did not want to absorb the friction of the responsible decision at the time the decision needed to be made. That is why the organization rushed toward failure. Not because nobody knew, but because the people with authority did not want the warning to change the plan. So PACE shows what leadership should have done. The primary path should have been to correct and verify the material vulnerabilities before the capability entered the intended operating environment. The alternate path could have reduced scope, disabled the exposed function, limited access, isolated the system, or staged the release while correction continued. The contingency path could have formally accepted temporary risk under controlled conditions, name the weakness, assign the owner, establish mitigation, limit use, monitor the condition, set the return date, define what ends the exception. The emergency path should have been prepared before the red team. If testing confirmed unacceptable exposure, contain the capability, protect data, restrict access, notify the appropriate authority, correct the highest consequence weakness, and retest before restoring use. Any one of those paths would have been more responsible than the path leadership chose. The path leadership chose was hope. Hope the weakness would not matter, hope the red team would miss it, hope the demonstration would create enough momentum to outrun the technical debt, hope nobody would remember the earlier warning, hope the team could repair it quickly if the issue became visible. Hope is not a control. TMC should have converted the decision into clear direction. What work was approved? Who owned it? What resources were assigned? What communication method would preserve status? Who controlled release? What evidence would close the issue? None of that was established. Then FLS should have protected execution. You cannot add emergency remediation to the original feature load, maintain the same delivery date, leave staffing unchanged, and expect the team to absorb it through effort. That is not execution discipline. That is executive failure being financed with employee exhaustion. Somebody has to say that. If leadership creates unplanned work through a decision it made, leadership has to change priorities, move dates, add resources, or reduce scope. The team cannot create capacity because an executive is embarrassed. And now we need to address the cleanup. First, protect the capability, validate the red team findings, contain the highest consequence exposure, restrict access where necessary, protect customer systems and data, prioritize the technical corrections, assign resources, establish the retest criteria. Second, protect the record. Gather the original vulnerability reports, emails, backlog entries, meeting notes, architecture decisions, funding discussions, test evidence, release approvals, and leadership direction. Build the timeline. Do not allow the organization to replace evidence with executive recollection. Third, state the governing standard. Name the technical requirement, internal policy, customer baseline, contractual obligation, or accepted development practice that applied. Identify when it applied and who was responsible for implementation, verification, resource allocation, exception approval, and release. Fourth, correct the accountability statement. The team raised the issue. Leadership chose not to prioritize the correction. The red team confirmed the consequence. The organization now has to correct both the technical vulnerability and the leadership process. That statement may make executives uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort is not damage. Dishonesty is damage. Fifth, repair the operating plan. Emergency remediation will displace something. Name what moves. Reduce the feature load. Change the milestone. Add qualified people. Fund external support if necessary. Do not hide the capacity problem by pushing it into evenings, weekends, and the private lives of junior staff. Sixth, repair the governance path. Define who can accept cybersecurity risk. Establish what information must accompany the decision. Require an owner mitigation, operating limits, review date, and expiration condition. Make sure the person accepting the risk has authority equal to the consequence. Seventh, repair the culture. Tell the team plainly that the earlier warning was valid. Protect the people who raised it. Do not retaliate, isolate, downgrade, or quietly damage their careers, because the record creates discomfort for leadership, and then prove the change through action. The next warning has to move differently. The next technical disagreement has to receive a decision. The next exception has to have an owner. The next red team finding has to begin with evidence, not blame. Trust will not return because an executive says, "We value transparency." Trust returns when people see that transparency survives contact with bad news. Now, I want to speak directly to the technical team. You did your job in this case. You found the vulnerability, made it visible, explained what it could do, documented it, recommended correction, and elevated it. Do not allow leadership to convince you that you failed simply because you did not possess the authority to override leadership. That does not mean you stop reviewing your communication. Strong professionals always ask how the warning could be clearer, earlier, more specific, or better connected to consequence. Keep doing that, but do not accept responsibility that belongs to the person who controlled the decision. Preserve the facts, use accurate language, do not exaggerate, do not speculate about motive when the decision record is enough. State what was known, what was recommended, what direction was received, and what the red team confirmed. Stay professional, stay firm. Do not surrender the truth to make an executive more comfortable. Now I want to speak directly to the leader. This type of leadership is unacceptable. If your team brings you a credible vulnerability and you decide not to act, own the decision. Put your name on the risk. State what you are accepting, explain why, limit the exposure, set the return point, tell the right people, provide the resources when correction is due. When the predicted consequence arrives, stand in front of your team. Do not hide behind them. Do not ask junior employees to clean the software, rebuild the records, brief the customer, absorb the overtime, and carry the blame while you protect your title. That is not leadership. That is just plain old-fashioned cowardice with organizational authority. Disgusting. Command presence is not sounding confident in the failure meeting. Command presence is owning the decision before the failure. It is telling the customer the truth. It is telling senior leadership, the team raised this. I chose the priority. I own that trade-off. We are correcting it. That is what responsibility sounds like. That is what integrity looks like when the result is bad. Anybody can own the win. Leadership is revealed by who owns the invoice. Bring this back to your own organization. What warning is currently sitting in a backlog because leadership did not like the cost? What standard will suddenly become important if an external assessor finds the problem tomorrow? What technical employee is quietly building workarounds around an executive decision? What supervisor is spending nights keeping the team from being crushed by a schedule that no longer reflects reality? What risk has been described as accepted even though nobody with authority put their name on it? What test has been delayed because leadership does not want to know the answer yet? What customer promise depends on the team continuing to perform invisible cleanup? What story will leadership tell if that exposure becomes public? Do not wait for the red team to answer those questions for you. Ask them now, what did you know? What did you do? Who did you tell? Then go one step further. Who had authority? Who controlled the resources? Who approved the schedule? Who accepted the risk? Who benefited from moving forward? Who is being asked to absorb the consequence? That is how you find the real accountability chain. The lesson is not that technical teams are never responsible. They are. The lesson is that accountability must follow the actual decision. In this case, the technical team identified, translated, documented, recommended, and escalated. Leadership dismissed, deferred, under-resourced, failed to control, and then blamed. That is the truth. The red team did not create the failure. It made leadership's unresolved decision visible. Now fix the vulnerability, the release process, the risk governance path, the resource plan, and the record. Then fix the leadership behavior that forced junior staff to clean up an executive decision while defending themselves against a false story. Because if you patch the software and leave that leadership behavior untouched, the organization is still compromised. The next vulnerability will be different. The next warning will be quieter. The next cleanup will cost more, and the best people may not be there to save you from it. Thanks for listening to the briefing.